Belief alone doesn't cut it, unlike what Disney movies tell you. You really have to put everything on the line. 45 years ago, I came out here to get into the business. Long story short, I did. Fortunately for me to have gotten into it at that point in time, it prepared me for the worst that can happen. In the 1970s is just appalling, like the apocalypse. It was the Dust Bowl. And in a commercial art school in the 70s, is don't get into animation, kid, it's dying. Because the television cartoons that were starting to come in gradually replaced the old classic cartoons in every way. The industry was really on life support, man. I was really fascinated in how it was done. And whenever they would show, like Walt Disney would walk around the studio and Frank Thomas or Ward Kimball, and they'd flip the drawings. I didn't want to be Walt, but that guy in the chair. And I remember seeing that chair and thinking, boy, that looks comfortable. I want to be that guy in that chair. I didn't want to be anything else ever.
You've done something that nobody else has ever done.
Two back-to-back Disney features, Sword in the Stone and The Jungle Book. Those two pictures, they're very different in a lot of ways. They're very similar in a lot of ways because they're both really animators movies. Jungle Book works as a story. I don't think Sword in the Stone.
So, Will Finn, if you could, for me and everyone listening, please introduce yourself to everyone, for anyone who may not know you bizarrely. Tell me a little bit about why you do what you do.
Yeah, my name is Will Finn. I've been working in animation since 1979. So here we are in 2024.
Wow.
45 years ago, I came out here to get into the business, and long story short, I did. And it's been a real roller coaster. I'm probably best known as the supervising animator of Iago in Disney's Aladdin. He was the parrot with Gilbert Gottfried's voice, and that was certainly a major highlight and a big high point for me. And right before that, I'd been the supervising animator on Cogsworth, The Clock, and Beauty and the Beast. Another just amazing thing that I was a dream come true. I was also the lead animator on Lord Grimsby, who was Prince Eric's sidekick in Little Mermaid. Character I absolutely love. Nobody remembers him in the movie, but he's a wonderful sort of deadpan character, and so lead animator on the Chair Mouse and Rescuers Down Under, and Laverne, the Lady Gargoyle in Hunchback, and that led to story head opportunities and directing opportunities, which have all been kind of hit and miss. Wound up at DreamWorks a couple times, worked on The Road to El Dorado. I was one of the early directors on that, but I left the picture early, and I'd worked with David Silverman, who was a great pal and one of the greatest creators of The Simpsons. And let's see, a lot of different features, indie features for a while, for about 10 years. And then in the last 7 or 8 years, I've been doing story work mainly for Warner Brothers TV for Tom and Jerry series. There was a daily series for Tom and Jerry that ran about 5 seasons. It played mostly in Europe. I don't think it played a lot here, but it was on Boomerang. It was produced through Renegade, my pal Daryl Van Sitters and Ashley Postlethwaite. And yeah, that brings us up to right about now.
Wow. Yeah, and I'm sure there's so much missing in there as well, because it's like, what did you say, 45 years ago? Is that how long ago you moved?
It goes by like that, friends. Yeah. It really does. It's, I feel like Grandpa Simpson sometimes because everything inspires a memory. And on the last job I was on, I was working with a very young Finnish crew and a Gigglebug. We were doing a Tom and Jerry series that got canceled, unfortunately, due to management changes at Warner. But So, and the team that I worked with here in LA and in Finland, they were like, tell us another story, Grandpa. It's just like, I, but it really is. I mean, that's why that character is so funny in The Simpsons. Grandpa just always, he either has a memory or he lapses into a nap. And that's kind of the phase of life I'm hitting right around now. So it's between napping and long rambling stories like the one I'm telling now.
Well, it's funny when you brought up Grandpa Simpson. A scene came instantly to mind where he's at a checkout counter, and the woman, and he pulls out a dime or something. He's like, "Oh, I remember this dime, and 1945, and I got up in the morning and I decided to have toast, and I set the toaster dial to 3." And it's just a queue of people like, please, come on, I love that reference.
Yeah.
It's so good. I guess my question was also, thank you for introducing yourself, but so animation is something that speaks truly to you. What were the first catalyst moments that if you can remember back that far, when you decided to get into it?
This is going to dovetail with our topic because I was born in a really pivotal year for animation and pop culture in general. I was born at the end of 1958. So that was the year Hanna-Barbera started making TV cartoons for television. And the only person who had tried that prior to that was Jay Ward with this sort of abortive series that was Crusader Rabbit, which I'm not very familiar with. But there was nothing on TV for the first 10 years of TV in animation except classic animation. So when I was a very little kid, that was mostly what was running, was Popeye, Tom and Jerry, the Disney stuff. Walt Disney was still on TV every Sunday night, introducing his show and interacting with the cartoon characters. Looney Tunes, of course, Tex Avery, and those, it was just like, it was just, TV was awash with all these wonderful, fully animated classic cartoons. And they were all new to us as little kids. And just right away, I mean, I have 5 brothers and sisters, and we all watched TV all the time. But I was really fascinated. I was just a little bit more interested than anybody else I knew in how it was done. And whenever they would show, like Walt Disney would like walk around the studio and talk about animation, and then he'd come into like a little office, and it'd be like Frank Thomas or Ward Kimball, and they'd flip the drawings. I didn't want to be Walt. It's like he looked like he didn't have any fun. He was the boss, and he had to wear a tie and deal with banks and things like that. But that guy in the chair, and I remember seeing that chair and thinking, boy, that looks comfortable. But it's something about that sight, and I want to be that guy in that chair, really from an early age, and it never wavered. I didn't want to be anything else ever. And ironically, over the next 20 years as I grew up, the industry was dying because the television cartoons that were starting to come in gradually replaced the old classic cartoons in every way. And so during my childhood, they were running cheek by jowl together. And I thought, well, it's just, there's some cartoons that are low budget and limited, and then there's some cartoons that are not. But no, it's like low budget was the way it was going the entire time. So when I got out here in the late 70s, the industry was really on life support, man. And again, it's just a product of being where I am in life. A lot of young people I talk to, even people who are really enthusiastic and interested in being in animation, they aren't aware of how just how dead the business was. I mean, I went to a commercial art school. I didn't go to like a fine art school. And even in a commercial art school in the 70s, says, don't get into animation, kid. It's dying. And so I didn't listen, and I made my way out here. And I got into it through the good graces of a lot of good people. Eric Larson at Disney, who I met while I was in school. And he was just wonderful. I wouldn't be here, if not for Eric and his encouragement. And and his inspiration, he was a very inspiring guy. He inspired us all. Prince Eric in Little Mermaid is named after Eric Larson because he was mentor to Musker and Clemens and Glenn Keane and all of us. So anyways, so it was a thing that literally from the, it literally was a calling, which, most people have callings for very higher things. It's kind of a trivial thing to be called to draw cartoons, but it was, I don't know who I'd be if that hadn't arrested my attention and ambition as a little kid. And I always like to tell people that I was not gifted with talent, but I was gifted with the desire to learn how to draw. And so I drew all the time as a kid. I wasn't interested in anything else. And it led me to here. I mean, I still draw every day. I'm still fascinated by animation. I remember the first time I saw a flip book where you could, flip the little pages and a little character would come to life. And I was just like, wow. So I'd make my own, and my brother Jim, who could draw very well too, he would do it. We would, concoct little stories. And it's just one of those things, you get bitten by the bug and then there's no saving you.
I'm curious because, like, you're up against a lot there, right? You're up against a dying industry. You're up against people saying, listen, kid, no future here. Don't waste your time. But yet there's still something inside you that pursues that path almost recklessly, right? If there's nothing else to it. But I'm curious of your thoughts on that.
I've been involved in writing on and off, and I've read a lot about writing, and I've read a lot of writing, but writers will say that you're not a writer if you just want to write, but you haven't written anything. You're a writer if you can't not write. If nobody can stop you, if you have to write. And I had to do this. I don't know where I got the confidence and optimism, but it was there. It was just, I believed it. And belief alone doesn't cut it. Unlike what Disney movies tell you, you really have to put everything on the line. And, it is only because a lot of other crazy people had the same dream, my age, from my generation, they had the same dream and got out here and sweated through that decade of doldrums to get to the point where literally planets aligned. It was so many lucky breaks because the business almost did go under countless times. Disney almost went under. And, just one by one, these things happened, and suddenly there was interest in the art form again, and interest in doing something new things and old things, and so that all hit right around the time I'd been in it for 10 years. So I was by no means, to use the term loosely, a master of anything, but I'd been at it for 10 years. So those of us who'd been at it for 10, 12 years, 10, 15 years or more, at that point, we were rock stars all of a sudden because we had training. And nobody else trying to get into the business, they were, at that, we had that kind of training. So for a little while, we were rock stars. And then every art school on the planet started teaching animation because there was money in it, which I think is a good thing. One of the things that I think happened in the 1950s as the industry started to shrink is the one thing I hold against the golden age generation is that they sort of froze people out. Towards the end of the 50s, they stopped training people because the jobs just weren't going to be there. And so they sort of circled the wagons and kept young people out. And that was bad for business because what you had then for the next 20 or so years was the same people doing the same stuff over and over again. And it just got diminishing returns. And so the audience went away. The funding for, quality projects went away. And that just impacted the business. Now, there are so many people and so many young people getting into it. I don't think that's ever going to happen again. And it's certainly it makes my life harder because I have to compete with those folks for jobs. But I'm grateful for it because I don't see the business atrophying like it did in the 70s. I mean, it just the hardening of the arteries of animation in the 1970s is just appalling. I would call it just it was like the apocalypse. It was the Dust Bowl, creatively, financially, and there were, good old pros here who did train people like Eric Larson. I got to meet Michael Law, who was Tex Avery's right-hand man, and he was very nice. But they just didn't, a lot of them just didn't have time to train people. And they were making commercials or whatever, they could scrape their income out with. And yeah, so it took a long time, and you have to be, fortunately for me to have gotten into it at that point in time, it prepared me for the worst that can happen. Last year was a pretty rough year. 2008 was a rough year, but I'd lived through the Dust Bowl of the 70s. So
I like that phrase a lot.
it
The Dust Bowl. You keep saying it, but it makes total sense because, and you did say we would dovetail into the topic we were talking about. We didn't quite get there yet, so I'd love if you could introduce what you picked to talk about, Will, because I'm so excited about this.
Well, we'll see how much I digress, but we talked about. You asked me for a topic, and I wanted to propose talking about my insights, or whatever you'd call my views on two back-to-back Disney features: Sword in the Stone and The Sword in the Stone and Jungle Book, the Jungle Book, which came out when I was a little kid. And they're very much a reflection of their time, which they both 64, I think. Sword in the Stone came out. I might have that wrong. Jungle Book was 67. I know that. I was 9. So those two pictures, they're very different in a lot of ways. They're very similar in a lot of ways, and a lot of things went on behind the scenes to make them different and similar. And I just, they're two of my favorite movies to watch because they're both really animators movies. Jungle Book works as a story. I don't think Sword in the Stone does. But you have to go back to the 50s. And again, this whole thing about the brain drain that began after Sleeping Beauty. Because, and again, this is based on my conjecture, my readings, and things that I have been able to discuss with some of the people that I did know from that era, like the late Bernie Mattinson, the late Vance Gary, Eric Larson, who co-directed Sleeping Beauty, and just getting little bits and pieces. It was always I was always very self-conscious, and while working with these guys, and I often saw them every day, but I didn't, want to, tell me this story. I didn't want to pick their brains for Disney trivia, because they were still working, And Vance especially, he was so humble, and he did not like to, gild the lily and pretend that everything was all marvelous. But every now and then they'd, let me know a little bit. And But what happened, and I'll do this quick, but in the 1950s, Disney continued to make animation, and he continued. They had to put features on hold all through the 40s because they completed Pinocchio in 1940, but then the war hit, and the war economy killed film distribution and the ability to make full-length, big-budget cartoons. They got involved in training films for the Army and all that. And all through the 1940s, Disney kept wanting to get back into features. They made Fantasia, which is kind of an omnibus movie. They made a bunch of those omnibus movies like Fun and Fancy Free and Make My Music. And, the one big story he really wanted to get to after he decided on what to do as a follow-up was, the Bambi and Dumbo both came out during the 40s, early 40s too. But he couldn't get back to like a full-on feature-length fairy tale. And the one he wanted to do, according to everybody I talked to, was Cinderella. And he could not get his head around, he could not get the money to work. The budget for Cinderella kept coming out to be too high. And the story goes that the studio was in dire straits in the late 40s. Howard Hughes was apparently looking at the lot, wanting to buy it up, and they'd gone public, and but they were still struggling, and they had to get a feature going, and so they bit the bullet and they made the version, not the version of Cinderella that they wanted to make, but they made the version they could make. And according to everything I've heard, Ken O'Connor, who was the art director, production designer, I forget which, he had a lot to do with finessing where the money would go, where they'd spend money and where they wouldn't. And one of the things that they had to do, and this was one of, I think, Walt's stumbling block, was the big ballroom. They had to do that in a way that wouldn't break the bank, because the big, festival where he's going to meet Prince is going to meet all the girls, that sounds like a big budget scene, no matter how you slice it. And so they found ways around it. They used rotoscope. They also had the romantic beat play out in private when he dances her out into the garden, which is just freaking genius, and so much better, and again and again, the things that really impressed me about Disney is that when they often were put to the test, like they made Dumbo on a really strict budget, and sometimes that brings out the best in everybody. So where I'm getting to this is that turned fortunes around for the studio. Cinderella was a big hit. Then they had tons of money, and they started pumping out feature films pretty fast and furious from that point on. They were training a lot of people, at the end of the 50s, you had Sleeping Beauty, which was Disney's next big, in his mind, is a big epic. We've done Snow White, we've done Cinderella, now we're going to do Sleeping Beauty. Sleeping Beauty was put into production in the mid-50s and cost a lot of money and took a long time to make because Walt's attention was divided by Disneyland, And what happened, I think this is particularly well covered in Neil Gabler's biography of Walt. For so many reasons, Sleeping Beauty is this artistic triumph, but it was a big box office failure. And it almost could not be because of how much it cost. And at the time, they must have assumed the more money we put into this thing, it's going to pay back by just being this huge hit. And it really wasn't in a big way. And that was, again, with the advent of TV animation and low budgets starting to come in, it was sort of like a, it was a sea change. It was a huge moment. There was a book that came out at the end of the 50s called The Art of Animation. It was written by Bob Thomas, who I years later met, and he also wrote Disney's biography in the 70s. And it was about the animation process. And very funnily enough, I had an abridged version of that book that I lived with as a kid. But the last chapter, last page of the book is telling you how to tailor your portfolio to come work at Disney and everything. And the irony is the book, of course, was written and came out ahead of Sleeping Beauty. And all of the production information, not all of it, most of the production information in the book is about Sleeping Beauty because A, they're promoting the movie, but B, they're really explaining how the process is being done, and they want to be as up to date as possible. They end with this chapter, how to get to Disney with your portfolio. And the movie came out, and they stopped hiring. They just laid people off in droves. And, they kept people on through, I guess it got worse after 101 Dalmatians, which was actually a success, but Starting around 1960, it was like the bloodletting began, and no one was safe. Nothing was sacred, and people were being let go, and they were trimming the staff. And so they had to find more economical ways of making movies. I think Walt, in his own way, and I don't know much about the man. Obviously, he died when I was 8. But I think he, at some point in there, started taking a different attitude towards storytelling. He always had a very freewheeling sense of storytelling that was also pretty accurate for the most part. But they started playing around with a more lighthearted approach. The next big feature after Sleeping Beauty was 101 Dalmatians. It wasn't based on a fairy tale. It was based on a contemporary book set in contemporary times. That was a big change for Disney. They had very, stylish, post 50s, design ethic. They employed the Xerox process to replace the hand inking, the ink and paint department. And the film was produced relatively inexpensively compared to its predecessor. So that kind of saved the division. I mean, the studio didn't need saving at that point, but the division, was charged with, we got to pull on our belts, figure out a way to make these things so we don't run into another Sleeping Beauty. So that brings us up to the early 60s, and I think they started putting Winnie the Pooh. Yeah, they put Winnie the Pooh into production. It was originally going to be a feature. Roy Disney Jr. told me that they were going to do it as a feature, and they actually had roughed out the storyboards for Blustery Day, Winnie the Pooh and Tigger 2, and then the last one, which I forget what it's called. But it was all going to run together. And when they were showing it to Walt, Roy said they got to about the 20-minute mark. And Walt turned to everybody and says, I think does anybody want to continue? And they were all like, oh. And he said, no, it's fine. It's just, I don't think you can put people, I think you can do 90 minutes of this. It's just too gentle. It's too thin. So they put it into production as he said, we'll break them up and we'll do them as featurettes, and then we could run them on TV, and which they did. But he saw things that quickly and that far in advance, which is I always worry. And talking about Walt Disney, he's the most overpraised and overdamned person in the 20th century, because people either want him to be perfect or to be, the worst person ever lived. I try to see him as more realistically, and for all of his faults, still a fascinating person. Obviously, somebody had a big impact on me. So after 101 Dalmatians, they're scouting around for other properties to do. Mark Davis very famously tried to launch a version of Chanticleer and Renard the Fox, which come from Germany, I think. So Mark Davis did these incredible presentation boards, and Mark Davis did, he created the storyboards for Pirates of the Caribbean and Country Bears Jamboree, if anybody remembers that. Big favorite of mine. And he wanted to do the story. Chanticleer is a rooster who's very conceited, and he thinks that the sun comes up because he crows. And then the slippery fox Renard comes into the story and almost defeats him, but he finally wins. So then what he did was he set it up in sort of like a post Chaucerian. It's almost like 1800s, top hats, things like that, and big flowery ties. There's, an all animal cast in this thing. And at the same time, they had some other things on the boards. They were doing Mary Poppins, obviously it was a go, and they were doing it. But Disney had bought the rights to a lot of books, the movie rights to a lot of stories that weren't PD in the 1930s after the success of Snow White, and they were holding on to The Sword and the Stone, which was a book by T.H. White about King Arthur, young King Arthur, and old Merlin. And so that was sort of floating around, and I think they had Bill Peet developing it, the great Bill Peet, the greatest. But when they pitched the Chanticleer story, according to guys I talked to, that Waltz felt fairly strongly that you couldn't make a hero out of a chicken. And allegedly one of the top animators said as much in the meeting, and pretty much popped that bubble. And the Art Davis went on to, as I say, he went into development for the parks at that point, and he was, I think, a little discouraged that didn't go over. It was a good idea. They made a storybook out of it a few years ago, 30 probably. But so the next thing up was Sword of the Stone, and it's the story, obviously, of how Merlin mentors King Arthur. And Bill Peet, who was the lead story man on the show, and Bill Peet had written like a full-on screenplay for 101 Dalmatians. He adapted that, and was very much instrumental in the success of that movie, 101 Dalmatians, as a piece of storytelling. So Disney was willing to just trust him with Sword in the Stone, and I think, according to animators I talked to who were there at the time, Disney just really said, Bill's got this, and walked away, and didn't, for the first time in history, didn't really get micromanaging about what they were doing every day. So Bill Peet, and I think Vance Gary, and I think maybe Floyd Norman, and a few other people just sort of went through and started working out the story. Now, here's what complicates it. This is why I'm so glad I have a forum to talk about this, because I can't even write about it. It's so complicated. The book that they bought the rights to is called The Sword and the Stone. T.H. White, the writer, wrote ultimately 3 books about King Arthur. The Sword and the Stone was about Arthur's youth and being trained by Merlin. Then The Once and Future King is about him as an adult, as King Arthur. And then the last story is about the end of Camelot, and it's called, the book is called The Candle in the Wind. And then later, he consolidated all 3 novels into one big book called The Once and Future King. And when he did, he almost completely rewrote The Sword and the Stone, which is the version most people are familiar with when I talk to them about T.H. White. And I've read it, but I remember finding in the library when I was a trainee, a struggling trainee at Disney in 1979, I found the copy that they used to work from 1937 or whenever it was, of The Sword and the Stone. So obviously I signed it out, and I read it, frantically. And Ed Funicello's brother was the studio librarian. There was a little tiny, almost a cubicle that consisted of the library in the Disney Animation Building on the 3rd floor. And her brother was the librarian. Anyways, I took the book out, I read it, and it was very, to my surprise, I was already familiar with the movie at this point. It's more like the movie than the later version is, and it's very different than the later version of Sword in the Stone is. So that's one of the things that adds to the confusion of how the movie was made and how it came to be. I'm probably going on way too long. I hope you're going to edit this.
I don't edit. I will say, Will, just before you go on, I love long answers. So you take your time, talk through this. This is great stuff. Okay, don't you worry. I tend not to edit
Well,
what people say. I just let them go. So
well, occasionally I'll get an email out of the blue from some kid, and if it's a student, like somebody I usually like to answer questions. I don't like to answer trivia questions for kids who just want to, because I finally told one kid who wrote to me too many times. I said the problem with your questions is I don't have short answers to any of them, and I can't really take time out to write to you on a regular basis about all this stuff. But this is a great opportunity to do this. So again, these aren't even my stories. These are third-hand stories.
well, it is your choice. Like you've done something that nobody else has ever done, which I find so amazing, which is you've picked two things to talk about that kind of connect into each other, right? Most people, well, some people have picked artists, which is like their whole life's work, and they're talking about the auteur. Some people pick an animated movie, right? But you've picked two, and what I'm curious about is, and you're peppering it in there, is how these impacted you throughout your development and why you picked them. Do you know what I mean? And you're layering that through. You're layering that through because this is an amazing thing that you're doing totally, which is you're giving us the history, or as you've kind of laid it as trivia. But this is great stuff. Like I don't think a lot of people know this, especially about the difference of the book, because something that I was always curious about was, Bill Peet, obviously an incredible story man, left the studio during the development of the Jungle Book due to, well, as I'm sure I'll let you get into it, but single-handedly had 101 Dalmatians and Sword in the Stone basically worked out. But, rewatching Sword in the Stone myself, I don't know how to describe it. Like, it's not at all a traditional narrative, right? There's not huge stakes. It's just like we're training this boy and everyone knows where he's going, but how he's getting there is different. Like a villain doesn't really show up until 3/4 of the way in and is very deftly dealt with, Madam Mim, just dealt with. And but it's all these stories of danger, which is totally different to something like the Jungle Book. But it's also so similar because the Jungle Book is like character-driven moments.
Well, they're both very episodic.
Very episodic,
They're both
yes.
very, very episodic, which I don't have a problem with picaresque or episodic stories.
Yeah.
We used to get bombarded, but by the time I was, back at Disney in the mid-late 80s and dealing with development people, everybody thought they knew what Disney was. And, it's like, they say, oh, I don't like this story. It's episodic. It's like, who cares? Don Quixote's episodic. Pinocchio's episodic. Pinocchio works because, somebody, well, there's no consistent villain. So it's the puppeteer first, and then it's the fox, and then it's the whale, and then so no. It's Pinocchio works because the consistent villain all through the story is Pinocchio. He is his own worst enemy. First, through no fault of his own, because he was born yesterday and he's stupid. But then when he gets tricked, so he gets tricked by Stromboli, or by the fox, he winds up with Stromboli. And then he gets away with it because he's forgiven, because he's ignorant. But then the second time, when he winds up in...
Pleasure Island.
Pleasure Island. I'm really digressing.
No, it's okay. Keep going.
He pays for it. He becomes a freak. He almost gets turned into. No, but I mean, it's just like it's real life.
Yeah.
You screw up and it changes you in ways that aren't necessarily good. But he gets away, and his conscience helps him. And now he has to confront the damage done by sending his father off to this, fool's errand to find him. And he faces and he sacrifices everything. This actually will come back to Sword in the Stone. So
come back to it straight away.
Trust me. but and then he's redeemed. I mean, it's perfect. I like it so much better where the story is, oh, the villain is a bad guy and the hero is wonderful, and we'll just kill the bad guy at the end, and now everything, because it externalizes evil. It externalizes, I don't know. I just find it very facile, and it's more typical of filmmaking now, and I that's why I love Pinocchio. It's why I love Jungle Book, and we'll come back to that. But okay, so I will try to sew this in. Yeah, it's a good thing I didn't do research for this, because I'm just extemporating, I think, but I think about these films so much. Okay, I'll try to wrap sort of this going up. A lot of,
You've been doing research for 30 years in this, you know what I mean? It's all coming out.
Yeah, plus, yeah. So the thing is, but like when I read the edition of Sword of the Stone that Disney bought the rights to, it's more like the movie than you'd think. And Walt was authorizing at a time when he was willing to be a lot more irreverent with the material. So Bill Peet was taking that and running with it. But, for instance, like when he says, blow me to Bermuda at the end, and then he comes back in Bermuda shorts, Merlin, that's in the book. Except he comes back in like Edwardian dress. But he's not wearing a 60s Bermuda tourist. But that gag is in there. The wizard's duel is in there, but Madame Mim is actually very beautiful, and she's a seductive witch. But Hecate is the witch from Shakespeare, and she's the referee, and she's more like the Madame Mim in the movie, who's artistically more or less based on the grandma from the Addams Family. I mean, you can't escape the influence of Charles Addams on cartooning in the 1960s. Anyways, so I'll try to.
You're about to go.
Narrow this down. But the story in Sword in the Stone in the book is the kid meets Merlin, or Merlin meets the kid, and he doesn't know why yet. And at the end, he realizes, oh, it's King Arthur. But the thing is, he teaches him all these things. He makes him into a fish. He makes him into a bird. He makes him into other animals I can't even remember now. In the rewrite,
yeah.
The squirrel. Well, in the rewrite of the book, he makes him into an ant for a while, and it's post-war. He rewrote the book, and it's kind of about the Nazis. The ants are sort of like, they do everything, just they follow orders. That's it. And there's also this beautiful scene where he teaches. I think this is in the later version, where he teaches Ward how to hear trees talk. The trees talk with the wind through their limbs, through their branches, and it takes ages for them to complete a sentence, But they've got all the time in the world. I mean, it's a very poetic book, and it's very beautifully written, and I very much respect it. But the thing is that T.H. did that Bill Peet didn't was that at the end, when Wart goes to pull the sword out and give it to Kay, he can't move it, and he doesn't know what to do, and he looks up, and again, it's not cinematic at all. It's very poetic, but he looks up and he sees in all the flags and the banners of all the people who've come to compete, he sees iconography of like the boar that taught him, to charge, and the fish that taught him to never let go. And they all cheer him on from the flags come to life, and that gives him the strength to pull the sword out of the stone. So it's very satisfying. I'm getting goosebumps describing it. It was very satisfying in the book. That doesn't happen in the movie. He just walks up and pulls the thing out. And apparently, and I wasn't there, and this is all third, fourth hand, but when Walt saw the finished movie, he really let Bill Peet and the crew run with it. And when he saw the finished movie, he says, this isn't a story. It's just a bunch of stuff that happens until he pulls the sword out of the stone. He was going to pull it out anyway. At any moment, he would have walked up to it, and it's preordained. And that is what's missing from the movie, which is why it doesn't really click. it also suffers from what a friend of mine calls backward storytelling. So you're supposed to get at the end, oh my gosh, it's King Arthur, but who cares? Backward storytelling is really difficult to do because you can get all the way to the end and then say, oh, here's my little surprise, M. Night Shyamalan ending. But it's like, so what? Now the movie's over. Which is how I felt when I saw the movie as a kid. It was the first time I was disappointed in a Disney movie. Okay, so those are the things about Sword in the Stone. And the strengths of it is, Bill Pete's design and, the individual sequences play like masterpieces,
beautifully.
The squirrel sequence, the Madame Mim sequence, which is flawless, the Wizard's Duel. And, but it just doesn't add up. It's just a bunch of fragmented. I mean, in that sense, it's an episodic story that doesn't work because the episodes don't impact each other. They don't. They certainly don't impact the climax.
Do you think then, because the Jungle Book definitely had the potential to do the exact same thing, right? It had that setup, it had that episodic way. And do you think that's part of the reason why Disney and Pete couldn't see eye to eye in the development?
Absolutely.
Of that? Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I know I don't want to overplay my hand here because I didn't know.
You weren't in the room. Yeah.
I wasn't in the room, and I didn't know. I got to work with Eric Larson, for a while, but and I exchanged letters with Ward Kimball when I was a kid, much to his grief, probably. But I got to talk to Frank Thomas in '79. And I asked him, I literally stopped him in the stairs. He came down and talked to us in like a lecture, and then he was walking back up the stairs and said, Mr. Thomas, what was the best Disney movie to work on? And I was like, and he goes, Sword in the Stone. And I was like, what?
Wow.
He said, Bill Pete gags, Walt left us alone, we did whatever we wanted. It was a ball. Every one of us had a ball. We thought it was a big hit. We never could figure out why it didn't click. Okay, what was the worst one? Pinocchio. I'm like, what? Pinocchio? And he says, I said, why? He says, that fairy says she can't help him, and then she does. She sends the dove back. And then, how does Pinocchio die at the end? And I say, he drowns. Yeah, after being underwater all day. And then he turned around and walked upstairs. And what can I say? He had me there. Yeah. But it works emotionally. And that little brief second of exchange with me, this titan of animation, was enlightening because they had so much fun that they lost the thread of what made a story great, and they just got it. I mean, for an animator to watch Sword in the Stone, like I say, every sequence is just, full of terrific animation. Milt Kahl going to town on, Bill Pete's designs and everything. So it had all of that, and I think Walt actually didn't give Sword in the Stone the full court press in the way of promotion and merchandising and all that. I noticed that even as a kid. But then I think Bill Pete, was feeling like doing the same thing with Jungle Book, as you say, because it does have the same episodic quality. And they just locked horns on the approach to the movie. And I think I think there was a sense of, and this is now I'm like really just going to be blind. I'll be blind here. Is that they were the way they were developing, and Walt Paraguay, the painter and the designer who'd done 101 Dalmatians famously and Sword in the Stone. I don't think his design stuff worked as well in Sword in the Stone, frankly, but I digress. They're doing their version of that for Jungle Book and working very closely, Pete and Paraguay, and I think that what they were trying to do was something very similar to Sword in the Stone, where it was sort of episodic. And I think they were also trying to treat the story a little bit more reverently because it was Rudyard Kipling, it's a classic and all of that. And Walt came in and just, said we wanted Dixieland music and Phil Harris and all this stuff. And it's just like, what? Vance Gary, who I did know well, it was the first time it was the third time he worked on a feature, sorry. Vance was, and he just did not like the movie. He would say to me, "The only reason you like Jungle Books because you didn't have to work on it." He said, "I just never knew where I was on that. We could never figure out because Walt was sort of intuiting his way through it, in his own way, improvising his way through it." And to make a very long story short, it's too late for that, isn't it? The way he intuited through the story, though, was a much more satisfying story because A, it was a more relatable thing. It wasn't a backward story. You had a goal. You have to get the kid to the man village before trouble starts. The tiger's coming back. Now, I locked horns with somebody in development about this in the 80s. It was the same thing. It was the same thing as the Pinocchio thing. Jungle Book's episodic. The villain doesn't show up until the third act, second act, technically. And I said, wait a second, who's the villain? He said, well, the tiger. I said, no, the villain is Mowgli. The goal is to get him to the man village, and the character who is fighting that all through once again, now we have an introspective story where a character has to overcome their own weaknesses rather than simply defeat a bad guy. And this character is young, he's a kid, and he wants to fit in everywhere he doesn't fit in. He wants to be a wolf. Well, he isn't a wolf. This is childhood, just psyche 101. He wants to be an alpha. Well, he is an alpha. He wants to be a bear. He isn't a bear. He isn't a monkey. He isn't a vulture. He isn't any of these things. And then finally, his surrogate parents, his surrogate same-gender parents, get him to where he belongs, and he realizes this is where I belong. And it's resonant, and the plot sort of moves forward in its own way. The relationship with the bear becomes the conflict, because they're going to have to separate at the end, and the pull of that is very emotional. Vance told me that at the rap party for Jungle Book, Frank Thomas said to him, I don't think we ever really nailed the relationship between the kid and the bear.
Really? Wow.
It's just like, what is he talking about? It works so well. And, the whole irreverence of bringing in Dixieland music and Louis Prima and the Beatles as the vulture. Walt was that, I love that Walt. And it's a shame he died. He died a year before the movie was finished, or before it was released. I think it finished about 6-8 months after he died. And he was a totally different guy than the guy who made Snow White, and Snow White, the ending where she's dead and they're all crying, that was considered the epitome of sophistication in animation, that them weeping over her dead body. And in Jungle Book, it's a joke. Baloo is sitting there lapping up praise, or he's lying there lapping up praise from Bagheera, muttering commentary under his breath, and it's hilarious. And he was okay with stuff like that. He was okay with the Beatles being the Vultures. He wasn't okay with the Beatles singing like the Vulture, with the Vultures singing like the Beatles. They changed the song. It was originally going to be, it wasn't very good. The thing is that, it was a more irreverent approach to a story, but it was Walt's approach. And he had gotten away from being hands-on in story during the mid-50s. So Sleeping Beauty kind of got away from him. And when he was participating, he was often not helping very much. He was contradicting himself because he was not weighing in that frequently. And then he let them sort of have free reign on 101 Dalmatians. It worked. He let them have freer reign still on Sword in the Stone. It didn't work. At that point, very fortunately, he got back involved. And he replaced Bill Peet with Ken Anderson, who's, one of my heroes. I've always loved Ken Anderson, and he was Bill Peet's bitterest rival. Bill Peet, basically was a man at war with everybody, and he did not, so he must have been particularly burned that he'd been replaced with Ken Anderson. And part of the thing, Ken was more willing to do whatever Walt said, but executed beautifully. And Vance and Bernie told me when he Walt pitched the ending, because they didn't know where the ending was. They said, "How's this thing going to wrap up? We don't even know." you know. And Walt said, "Okay, here's what happens. They get to the edge of the thing, and the tiger's vanquished, and he hears this. The kid hears a song, and they go walking out there, and there's a little girl, and she's drawing water from the river, and Vance said they were all dumbstruck. He said if anyone other than Walt Disney had pitched that idea, they would have been laughed out of the room. And I think even in the Frank and Ollie movie, Ollie talks about how, like, it took him a while to. I mean, he obviously warmed up to it. He did a lot of the sequence, and he did a fantastic job. Much love to Ollie. But he didn't think it would work at first either. It was really the Sherman Brothers and Ken Anderson. Ken storyboarded it, and the Sherman Brothers loved the idea, and there was opportunity for a song. And they wrote the song, and Ken did the board, and then it gradually grew on everybody. And it just feels right, So, it's the tale of two different episodic stories, but in one you have very driven and very dynamic conflicts happening within the main character, versus which is Jungle Book, where the kid doesn't want to go where he belongs. And the other thing they did was they avoided the whole thing of, I want to get even with the tiger for killing my parents, which is what the Jon Favreau movie tackled head on. Again, it's I just love Walt for saying, no, screw all that. That's a bunch of
icky sticky story stuff, I think, is the quote.
What do you call? What do I always call it? It's melodrama.
Melodrama.
It's just he needs it. And the kid wouldn't remember his parents if he was a baby, so he wouldn't care. So the whole and it's what they do now, and it's what they did. So I love the fact that they just took this story of a kid who loved being a wolf, and then the tiger is the ticking clock. That's what the tiger is. I mean, he is the ultimate. He's the final boss, if you will, in game speak. But he's not the villain. The villain is Mowgli's stubbornness and immaturity, and until that's conquered, it's just going to be impossible to bring him to where he belongs. And the Baloo and Bagheera relationship is so great. These two guys, this odd couple, raising this kid, and how funny they are together. And they're like a couple of, same gender parents, and just wonderful. And they walk off into the sunset together, which I just love. There's a sequence they didn't animate, which was too bad. There was a rhino character they were going to do.
Rocky the Rhino.
And Rocky. It was going to be Frank Fontaine, and you punch drunk, kind of. Frank Fontaine used to do a character on the Jackie Gleason show called Crazy Guggenheim, and it was based on. Now I'm forgetting the fighter's name. There was a famous fighter who talked like that because he was punch drunk, and somebody will remind me and scold me for getting it wrong. I have like about 10% accuracy when it comes to any like direct quote or anything like that. So take everything.
Great thing to add right at the end of a conversation.
Yeah.
After being like, by the way, only 10% of that is probably accurate.
The last thing I want to just sort of wedge in here, they're both animated movies, Sword in the Stone and Jungle Book. Really, the animators were at the height of their powers. I don't think they did any rotoscope in Sword in the Stone for human characters. They come across fantastically. And in Jungle Book, they were so good at animating animals by then. I like to say that they were dealing with, the animators were using concentric anthropomorphism. So that Baloo is a bear who reminds you of a man, who reminds you of a bear, who reminds you of a man, who reminds you of a bear. All the animals, they have those characteristics, and they're caricatured and they're believable at the same time. And the characters come out so strongly. It's just like, I could watch it right now. It's to me, it's the most watchable movie of my life. I put it on all the time.
Wow, what a great sentence.
Yeah.
To be honest, the Jungle Book is my favorite Disney movie of that ilk. It absolutely is. And I recently made a video about it, and that's why I didn't do any research either for this. I just watched The Sword in the Stone, and of course had made my video about the Jungle Book recently. But what astounded me the most from watching like documentary footage, and I've heard you talk about it, and Andreas and everyone, is I think the real secret to the success of the Jungle Book is, although everyone was shooting, like everyone was firing on full cylinders, right? Everyone in there, like you're saying, they're all at the top of their game. They thread that line of simplicity where you set up a ticking clock, the end goal, and everything just kind of rolls forward. Scene to scene is always moving forward. Like the next one feeds directly into the next one, which is different to what I found in Sword of the Stone. It's just kind of, now it's a bit of time and it's a bit later. It's very choppy, exactly.
Very choppy, yeah.
And whereas the Jungle Book, it just feels like this nice flow of story happening. Even when they cut back to the tiger and cow, or the tiger overhearing the elephants, there's just this simplicity that is so well done.
I hate to fetishize Walt Disney,
Yeah.
but I think that has everything to do with his innate sharpness and storytelling, because it's immediately missing from all the pictures that follow.
Yes, immediately. You're right.
They all suffer from sequencitis, I think that was the downfall of the Sword, and the downfall of most of the pictures after for a long time.
Until your time to rise, because when you guys came in the Renaissance, after you've been there for a while, the kind of narrative hold that those stories had is just tremendous. Like, it's so strong, but it took time to get there. If you watch something like Beauty and the Beast, it absolutely does not feel episodic, but it has those moments, right?
I got to credit Howard Ashman, and I didn't get a lot of experience of him directly, personally, but I just have so much respect for him. And I think Howard understood something better than anybody, the difference between a stage musical and a movie musical, which are two different animals, which is musicals are very hard to make on film. And my brother was a theater major, so I was exposed to every cast album from Oklahoma to Chorus Line. So I know a lot more about theater than I care to. But there's a difference. It takes so much effort to adapt a stage musical to a movie, and they're very different animals, and you have to be sharp. I think Cabaret is a great example, but and then again, the Disney movies are like musicals, but they're not structured the same way stage musicals are, or movie musicals. Everybody who came after was trying to treat the stories like stage musicals or movie musicals, but the Disney movie was like its own thing, and Howard got that. And I think his approach to songs and where they belong was much more like Walt's. I don't think through any intentionally, but he liked those films, and I think he got them, and they worked differently, and his ability to resonate with that, I think, helped. Oh my God, I can't believe how long I've been talking.
Well, it's great. This is amazing. I'm so happy to have it. I can, because we've been going an hour now, and I absolutely adore it, because you've given me everything that I wanted, which is just like a great conversation about these two topics.
I tremendously appreciate the opportunity, so thank you so much.
Listen, and I mean this in all sincerity, the pleasure is absolutely all on this side of the table. I really, really appreciate it, because, obviously I love your work, and it's something I wanted to address that you said earlier, which is, this calling seems a bit insignificant, the calling to animate, the calling to tell stories. But really, and I know you know this, so I know you're going to agree, but when you tell stories, it really is, I think, honestly, the greatest calling in humanity, because this is how we share learning about ourselves. This is how we share, enjoyment, fun, play, everything that's central to being a human comes out in the medium that we work in. And that's such a beautiful thing too, because it's not easy to do, right? Animation is a very difficult thing. So to get true to that point and then bring all that love with it, I think is honestly one of the best callings ever. Now, I'm a bit biased, I'm sure engineers say the same thing, but
Well,
yeah.
I don't know who I'd be if it hadn't happened, and I don't know even who to credit it to. Some people who want to do art, they grow up in families that discourage them. My family neither discouraged or encouraged. It's just people. My brother drew, my mother drew. People just drew. It wasn't like
No discussion. Yeah.
it wasn't a terrible thing. It wasn't a fabulous thing. It was just. It took me a long time to realize people didn't draw. Everybody.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been so much fun. Yeah, but thank you so much. I'll let you go.